everyone, and welcome to Dr. Marion's Learning Labs webinar series, where we will be addressing a range of important issues in reading, learning, and student success. My name is Sarah Shasavari, and I am the Education Coordinator at Dr. Marion's Learning Lab, as well as the host of today's webinar. As today's host, I will be able to view and present any questions you may have for Dr. Blank through the question and answer box that is available on your screen. So please feel free to type any questions you'd like Dr. Blank to answer in that Q&A box, and we will try to address them all if time allows. Now it's time to turn things over to the star of our series. She's an award-winning psychologist who is well known internationally for her many contributions to understanding and enhancing learning, and her name is Dr. Marion Blank. Hi, Dr. Blank. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Well, today's important topic is about language and communication and their links to school success. So I will hand it over to you, Dr. Blank, so we can get started.
Sure. What I like is the first slide. Right. And there's a famous proverb. People don't use proverbs very much now, but there was a famous one when I was young, and it says, the fish is the last one to discover water. And the Chinese, of course, I mean, these kinds of ideas are universal. The Chinese have it. If you want to know what water is like, don't ask the fish. In other words, things that just permeate our lives, we don't understand. We don't really see them as special. We just live with them. And so getting to understand children's language and communication has been a very slow process. In fact, it wasn't until the 1930s that they began any serious investigation into it. And we are still very far from understanding what goes on in these very important behaviors. So let's have the next slide.
Yes.
For example, if you went to somebody knowledgeable, intelligent, and said, what is language? They would have enormous trouble defining it. If you ask them, how did you learn to speak? I don't think anyone can answer that. How did you learn to read? People will say, I don't read. In fact, I went to school and I was reading and I just did what the teacher asked me to do, but I knew how to read before the teacher did anything. So these are very important issues, and we have very little insight into them in our own thinking. So can I have the next slide?
Yes.
Now, we're going to be covering today a lot of words and concepts that are very familiar. What's going to be different is that we're going to cover them in very different ways from the way in which they're usually analyzed. So first of all, language and communication are used almost as synonyms, but language is not equivalent to communication, and communication is not equivalent to language. They're different but interlinked systems. As a start, and that's far from the end, language is a complex system within a person. And it's a system that allows the person to take particular sounds and words and use them in a very systematic, rule-bound way. So that's a skill that a person possesses. Communication is a system between people that relies extensively on language as a tool for exchanging information, but it has far more than that. And one of the reasons that we haven't done enough in this area is certainly in education and psychology, there are no really good systems for dealing with dyads, with two people, or to dealing with more than one person. So we haven't really come out with models of communication that take account of the fact that it's a system between people, not a system within a person. You can't have communication if you don't have at least two people. Okay?
Yes.
Next. Now, what we're going to be covering today, and this is going to be a very quick tour of some very important language skills, not communication skills, language skills, and some of the key factors that govern the development and use of language. And what I've done is group them into very traditional groupings. So first of all, you have perceptual motor skills, so that, for example, if you don't hear, your language skills are going to be very impaired. That's the problem that deaf children face. If you have fine motor problems, you're not going to be able to produce language easily. So all the children with articulation disorders have great difficulty in this area. It is increasingly being found that what the group of children called nonverbal autistic children are not nonverbal. They are non-speaking because they don't have the fine motor skills for speaking. It has nothing to do with their ability to process language. So when we start looking at this in a really fine-grained way, we begin to see the world very differently. Now, a big area of language is what's called phonology. Those are the sounds of our language. And so, for example, a sound like, oh, no, I won't do that one. A sound like does not make sense. It's a sound, kids can produce it, but it's not part of our language system. We have the sounds of English are sounds like at and ba and da and m and that kind of thing. In neurotypical development, that's NT. In neurotypical development, phonology development continues to about 7 to 8 years of age. And that's why, and so it's a basically slow development, and there's a lot of modifiability. But then when it is fixed, it is fixed. So for example, if you're a 15-year-old moving to another country and speaking a new language, almost invariably you'll have a foreign accent. The reason is, in other words, phonology leads to or links with things like foreign accents. Now, the problems in phonology, if a child is having problems, they affect speech, in the example I just gave you, and they also affect reading. The vast bulk of reading research in the United States is on children's what's called children's phonological processing. So this dominates the field. And as I said, it's very hard to master after adolescence. So you can have very intelligent, sophisticated kids who will have a very heavy foreign accent because they learned to speak the language later. It's very interesting, but if you, in the early stages, in the early years of, let's say, between 2 and 5, if a child is learning 5 languages, he'll speak all of them perfectly with the right accent. So when he'll speak French, he'll have the right French accent. When he'll be speaking English, he'll have the right, when he'll be speaking Chinese, he'll have the right tones. It is amazingly flexible and open. And then it really starts shutting down at 7, and by 12 and 13, it's done. Now, semantics is very different. Semantics are the concepts of language, whether simple things like, oh, there's a kid, that's big, or something very complicated, like words like entropy or conservation. So semantics grow throughout life. There's no limit necessary or essential or necessarily operating. There tends to be 3 major ages in which development takes place. The first is the 2 to 6 year period, called often the preschool period. It's the everyday world. And children of 4 and 5 are very sophisticated in talking about their trips to the zoo, and they're talking about what story they heard. They're quite sophisticated, but it's the everyday world. It is not the more complex world where the major institutions of our life. So, for example, that children begin to get that in what's called the curriculum in school. So between 6 and 12, they're introduced to a lot of ideas that only come through literacy and through higher level language analysis. They're very different. So, for example, if you use the term government with a very bright 4-year-old, he wouldn't understand what you're talking about. But use the word government with an 11-year-old, he can have a pretty good idea. And then at Past 12, you get the adolescent period when you get the potential for the most sophisticated concepts that human beings have developed. So if you have a really bright student, you can discuss Einstein's theory with him. You can discuss theories of social dynamics. You can, and that is a hugely exciting period of intellectual development. So in general, people see the 2 to 6 year period as phenomenally important, which it is, because it gives the child understanding of the everyday world, and that's vital. But then in adolescence, they get the understanding of the highest level concepts that human beings can create. So this semantics is very affected by IQ. Or IQ is very affected by semantics. In other words, if you wanted to get 15 minutes to test a child and you want to know his IQ, well, it used to be, things are changing. It used to be you just gave him a vocabulary test. It had like a perfect correlation with intelligence. That's disappearing now because of the age of the computer, but we won't go into this right now. Semantics is also very affected by social class, and it's very affected by literacy. Semantics can continue to develop throughout life, but basically only if you're literate.
Okay.
That's the only group that really continues to show development of semantics. But, you know, for example, if you had used 30 years ago to say, well, I'll Google it, he'd think you're slightly crazy. But now, oh, okay, go Google it. So that's all semantics. Now, then a third major area of language is called syntax or grammar. So, for example, you can say in English, Mary saw her friend. You can't say friend her saw Mary. You can in certain languages, and I won't tell you how. In other words, word order in English is very tightly constrained. And so sentences don't have to make sense, and the children have to begin to grapple with this. And basically, for everyday speech, it's mastered by 6 years of age. If you have a well-functioning 6-year-old, you can have a very well-organized, sophisticated set of sentences going back and forth. Advanced syntax, the kind of statement like, when the imperial judge was faced with this enormous problem, he had to turn to his advisors. That kind of syntax is totally dependent on literacy, and you don't get it unless the person is highly literate. One of the, I think, maybe because I come from that generation, I think there is a known decline in language skills going on, and I think it's a tragedy. The explanation is, well, we're in a new age, we don't need this, we can have the computer do it for us. I don't want to go into that today, but I personally think that's very important. There's no reason we can't coexist and have high-level language and high-level computer skills. But we're being told, give up your language skills for the computer because he can do it so much better than you can. Not true, but that's what we're being told. Next slide.
Right. Can I ask you a question about the semantics? Actually, I'm curious.
Sure.
Does that mean increasing one's vocabulary or one's knowledge of concepts? Could that increase someone's IQ?
Oh, yes, definitely. But if it's just that, if it's taught just as an isolated skill, the way many behavioral programs are, it won't do anything.
Okay.
It has to be integrated into meaningful situations and in a variety of situations. So when you teach it in an isolated way to children, it'll be ineffective for the most part.
Got it. Okay. Really good to know.
Yeah. Now, all of the components of language have very important relationship to the clinical disorders that we see. So, for example, if there are difficulties in perceptual motor skills, we see it in deaf children, we see it in autistic children, we see it in children with cerebral palsy. There are others, but I'm giving you examples. In other words, the perceptual motor base is very important. And if it's really seriously impaired, like in the movie My Left Foot, if any of you saw it, the story of Christy Brown, because he had no ability in the fine motor realm necessary for producing language. Everybody thought he was a moron. And he writes about the fact how he listened to people talking about him as if he were a moron. And he understood everything, but he couldn't show to anyone at the time that he understood it all. So when a person doesn't speak, we often think they're totally incapable. This is a very big problem with senile people, or with people who are very impaired in old age and can't speak well. And people talk about them, and they will tell you how insulted they are because they're talked about like sort of defective organisms.
Right.
And it's just very unfortunate. Now, in the realm of phonology, you have articulation disorders, which, by the way, President Biden was known for that. He had it as a child, and it interfered till now in his production. And it's often equated with cognitive difficulty, but it's that getting the words out is very hard. The King of England, the father of Queen Elizabeth, had a very severe articulation disorder, and they made a famous movie about it. Anyone who wants to see it, because he had to make public speeches, and it was extremely hard for him. Now, another area currently that gets a huge amount of attention in terms of sounds or phonology is reading disabilities. The vast percentage of studies on reading difficulties is on phonological processing. And this has left the reading field in a very slanted way, but this is important to know, because when you're reading about reading disabilities, you're going to be reading a huge amount about phonological processing. Now, semantics comes into a different set of disabilities. First of all, children with attention deficit disorder are very commonly identified as having difficulty in higher level semantics. If the child has no other problems, early language development seems fine, but later language development is stymied, and we can go into why, but that has to do with communication difficulties, but it's a very important disorder. So commonly you'll read that there's been a decline in cognition in this child. He used to have an IQ of 135, and it's now down to 96, and it's because his concepts haven't developed. And so it plays a very big role in attention deficit disorder. It plays a huge role in learning disabilities, in intellectual disabilities, and it also plays a role in thought disorders. But fortunately, we don't really see many children with thought disorders. Thought disorders are the kind of thing that you see in schizophrenia, for example, where somebody looks at the plugs in a wall and says, "Oh, they're taping us. We've got to get that eliminated, or I got to leave this room." They misperceive the world. Fortunately, that is not a common issue for the vast majority of children. Okay. Now, syntax affects autism tremendously. That's autistic children tend to speak in, even the ones who are verbal, a very high percentage, we don't know the exact number, but even those who are verbal will speak in 2 and 3 word sentences that you then fill in. Mommy cookie, big bear, that kind of thing. And the parent generally will be very supportive of this because they're so anxious to get the language from the children. But the children with autism are known. Now, there are many very sophisticated people with autism, but children with autism are known to have poor language production throughout their life. It isn't like, okay, they didn't develop it by 10, but they'll develop it by 12. No, if they haven't developed it in the early years of life, they usually, not always, never develop it. And then the syntax you'll see in thought disorders, they used to use the term, it's not commonly used, word salad. They'd say the
Okay.
people are talking in words that like, like a salad is mixed up with lettuce and tomatoes and cucumbers. And it's just, and it doesn't matter which way you say it and so on. So, but fortunately, thought disorders, as I said before, are pretty rare.
Rare. Okay.
Next slide.
Okay.
Now, in semantics, I'm going to be covering a number of themes. Some of them you'll find familiar, some of them you may want to go over later, and I'm just trying to use this time to introduce them. In semantics, in the realm, that language realm, word frequency and conceptual level are two very important dimensions. So, for example, it is easier for children to handle high frequency words, like the man is wearing glasses, than to handle low frequency words, like the man is wearing spectacles. Same idea, nothing very different, but one tends to have fewer syllables and it's much more commonly used. And the vast majority of children in America would not know what spectacles means. Take a sentence like, again, the man attacked the woman. Pretty easy concept. The man assaulted the woman, much harder. If you take, then of course, sentences have lots of concepts. So they even take a sentence like the group agreed to a set of rules. There, if we said the delegates agreed to the Constitution, it's like an order of magnitude different because of low frequency versus high frequency. And low frequency words are very common in more advanced literacy materials. And so it's brutally hard for kids who have poor vocabularies to be able to understand that material.
So does that mean when speaking to children with learning disabilities, we should only be using high frequency words?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's very interesting. I mean, there are a number of options we can do, but one of them is to be very redundant. And it's just teachers are often told, talk less, let the kids talk more. That's a disaster. Children don't need to go to school to talk more. They can talk all the time. It's just, so if you take, let's take even the delegates agreed to the Constitution. If the teacher then is highly redundant and says, well, the delegates were a lot of men. There were at least 100 delegates at that meeting. If you give 2 or 3 sentences, you give the child time and information so he can process this. You're not questioning him yet. You're just presenting it. And if you say, agree to the Constitution. Now, the Constitution was a set of rules they made up, for example. And so if the teacher has the opportunity to not have a difficult class, and that's a huge problem, has the opportunity to present things in an interesting way, it's usually she, but she or he should be talking a lot more and giving a lot of redundancy, which gives the child time to process. If he doesn't get one sentence, he'll get another sentence. And it's very important to do this. It is almost never done because the teacher is under the pressure of a lot of kids who are not particularly interested in the classroom, and they're doing all kinds of things. So many teachers feel this enormous pressure to rush because otherwise they'll lose control of the class, when in fact it's just the opposite. But
Right.
the teacher has to have the right materials that will allow or enable the children to want to hear it. And it's very interesting, one of the things I use a lot are good movies, because kids love good movies. I use not exactly documentary, but films about real events like World War II or about slavery or things of that sort. And those materials they're made by very talented people, and they hold the children's attention. And so it's a fabulous way to improve a child's knowledge base and his vocabulary. So we have available lots of things. They're not being done. That's the sad thing.
That is, but good to know because we could start implementing some of these things. So thank you.
Well, thank you. You're welcome. Now, if we switch to communication, we're in a different area. And communication via language entails really two major aspects. One is social relatedness. That is the willingness and ability to deal with the visual, proprioceptive, and fine motor systems. One group of children that anyone who's dealt with autistic children knows that this is extraordinarily hard for them. I'll give you an example. This was a child who was misdiagnosed as autistic. He had a very serious visual problem, so he couldn't see things correctly. But anyway, at one point, he was 4 years of age, and I pointed, his vision wasn't that he couldn't see, he had nystagmus, so his images were constantly moving back and forth. So I pointed to something and I said, David, over there, and he, instead of looking over there, which a 6-month-old could do, he looked up my arm in total confusion because he had no idea what gestures mean. Autistic children face this day in and day out. They have no idea what your gesture system really means. And so they're terribly confused. So this is a vital part of communication because the person who's communicating thinks the other person understands, but these are just things you do automatically and don't think about. But for children with various types of sensory motor problems, they simply cannot perceive the social context of your message. Now, the language skills, they're all the skills listed earlier, the phonology, the syntax, the semantics. And with age, the level of the language keeps increasing in terms of concepts and in terms of syntax. So the syntax you'll see in a book for a high school student will be totally different than the syntax you'll see in a preschool book for 5-year-olds.
Okay, very good to know.
The next slide. Now, here's dialogue. Dialogue is communication. Dialogue is you've got at least 2 people. By 5 years of age, the neurotypical child is comfortable with using language to converse about concepts involving the here and now. It doesn't have to be here and now, but things that you can see in the here and now, they can talk about very comfortably. So you could have gone on a trip to the zoo and discuss it without the zoo being present. You could have talked about a trip to McDonald's. You could talk about a vacation the child has taken. Anything that is in the real world can now be discussed even when you're not there. And that's a huge, huge benefit in terms of a language skill. It allows you to discuss anything, anytime, being free of any perceptual input. There was perceptual input, but it doesn't have to be sustained if the child is normally functioning. The issues are, this is very important. Conversation with young children almost never has to deal with wants. Kids are fed. They don't have to say, I need food, please give me food. What the conversation with young children is remarkably sophisticated. I used to do a lot of studies on the conversation between 5-year-olds and their mothers, and it was just amazingly rich. And it wasn't about wants. It was all kinds of, there was one time, it was a really interesting dialogue. The mother was doing something and she suddenly says, oh, I forgot to plant the tomatoes. Kid says nothing, they keep talking. And then about 10 exchanges later, the kid says, I know why you said tomatoes. We were talking about food and that's what made you think about it. In other words, the child puts in enormous amounts of time into processing the language he hears. And that language is, in terms of the here and now discussions, is as good as any adult. You don't have to be an adult to discuss these things in an interesting way. And the key that receives very little attention is that this is all through connected sets of utterances. Isolated utterances are like raindrops that are falling all over in different places. That a real, now you don't need this tons and tons of time, but a real meaningful discussion, which is really important to the way a child thinks, those it always involves 5, 6, 7 exchanges. And that's where the child gets a tremendous amount of information. And if the child is well functioning, he or she can direct getting the information because he's able to ask questions of the adult that he's talking to. He's able to challenge the adult he's talking to. He wants to learn about the world. And so, but it can only happen through connected sets of exchanges.
Would you be able to provide us an example of a connected set of exchanges?
Oh, sure. Let's say, parent says, we plan to go to the zoo today, but it is really pouring outside. So why can't we go? Well, we're going to get soaked. And maybe you like getting soaked, but I do not like getting soaked. So we're going to have to pick another day. Okay, well, what day are we going? Well, the first sunny day that we have. I mean, that's a very simple conversation, but you've got 5 or 6 exchanges there. The mother doesn't say, oh, we're not going to the zoo, and your daddy is working late tonight, and the TV program tonight is going to be on George Washington. And by the way, my mother is going to be coming to visit next week. If you heard a conversation like that, you said, there's something wrong with these people.
Right.
And because there are no readily available techniques to offer teachers on how to evaluate sustained exchanges, almost nothing has been done in this direction. And very often, children are exposed then to totally disconnected exchanges. And the teacher has not been given the tools that he or she needs to get the child focused in a careful way. There's one dialogue that I picked up in a journal. Teacher says, okay, current events, Glenn, which is of course ridiculous to go, but the teachers are now racing. And so she says, so Glenn says, Pablo Casals, the famous cellist, died last week. And teacher didn't want that response, but the teacher's also trained never to say a child's wrong. So she says, well, Jim, and Jim says, the war in the Middle East is still going on. I did not make this up. This is in the journals. And she says, right. And do you know any change that's been taking place? Now, what? Now, if you're a child who is fairly interested in the environment, and you say, why did the teacher not follow up when I said Pablo Casals, and she did follow up when he talked about the war? Oh, I get it. She wants or he wants discussions about major international conflicts, and anything else is not on the table. But on the other hand, the teacher doesn't say something like, there's a war in the Middle East. It's a really big thing. And there have been some major changes in the last few days. Does anyone know about what's happened? Instead, the lack of connectedness of school dialogue is something that we've lived with so long that we think it's okay. But the language of school dialogue is characteristic of the problems of people with thought disorders, not because anyone has a thought disorder, but because of the way conversations in school have evolved. The children are exposed to an incoherent, unsustained conversation. So here's another one. Teacher says, today is Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Who knows who Abraham Lincoln was? Kid says he was shot. Teacher says, yes, he was shot. That is not an answer to who was Abraham Lincoln. Right. But the teacher has been given such a poor dialogue to use with the kids that she feels relieved when she gets something that's even in the ballpark. So children in school are exposed to language that if you actually sat down and analyzed it, is totally incoherent. And if a child, now, the bright kids who know language inside out and outside in say, I got it. I know what's happening. But I remember, for example, when I was in school, I had to learn in those days to define a noun as a person, place, or thing. So, Marion, what is a noun? A noun is a person, place, or thing. When I said it, I knew it was wrong. I knew that a noun was much more than a person, place, or thing. But what was I going to do? Say to the teacher, you gave me a crummy definition. I want to please the teacher. She likes me because I'm pleasing her and we get along. But we've actually
Right.
had a totally incoherent, inadequate conversation. That goes on all the time in school. And
Right.
we wonder why schools fail because they're presenting children with a communication system that is distorted, incomplete, and disconnected. It's a disaster. But we have, in general, an enormous failure rate in schools. We have a huge number of children who drop out. The average reading level in the United States of a high school graduate is 5th grade. And so teachers are under enormous pressure to cope with an absolutely crazy system. We can change it. In fact, I've written a long chapter many years ago on this, and we can put it online after this, and it'll be available to anyone who wants to read it. It's
Perfect.
how we could change the classroom dialogue, and we can. It's not. It does mean retraining people, but the effects are fabulous when you do, because you're now talking to children in ways that they find interesting and understandable. It is not understandable to say, who was Abraham Lincoln, to hear he was shot. But that's
Right.
what goes on. And then it was very interesting. One child with a very severe ADD said to me, she was in high school, she says, I hate it when the kids give answers. She says, I'd much rather listen to the teacher. She says, at least I get a nice, clear message. But then when the other kids start answering, they're all over the place. And I can't figure out which ones are the good answers and which ones are the bad answers.
Right.
So this business of let the children talk more, let the children feel free to express ideas, but to talk more, it's not going to lead to anything because it's very poor advice. And so most of the advice that is out there is just not qualified in the way it has to be qualified. It's now the other thing, for example, is we're never supposed to tell a child that they're wrong. I tell you, it's much better to tell a child that he's wrong in a nice way and indicate why than to say, Jeffrey didn't, Carol, will you tell Jeffrey X, Y, and Z? Children, if you explain to a child why something is insufficient and do it without condemnation, they're pleased.
Oh, yeah. Because otherwise they'll go around thinking that their wrong answer was correct too.
Or they just don't know. They just
Yeah.
don't know. And
Yeah.
and the history of how we got the dialogue we got is very interesting. We won't go into it today, but it comes from the time when there were very few books around, and the teacher was told, this is a long time ago, was to ask questions to make sure that the child read the very rare book that he could get hold of. And so you get random questions all over the place. That was basically testing whether they read the book. It had nothing to do with coherent discourse.
Right.
So the history lives on.
Yes. Okay.
Next one.
Sorry. There you go.
Okay. Now, one of the things to recognize is the complexity of language text for adults. So, for example, I didn't write this. This isn't a book that kids have to read. And I left out some of the words. But meanwhile, James Otis became the more flamboyant. Well, right there, you've lost 80% of the American population. It was inevitable that the moderation of his rights of the British colonies would eventually break down, and it was not surprising that James flew to extremes when his rights was criticized. This is what children, this is just one example, but this is what children have to face in high school texts. And the vast majority of them, it is absolute nonsense language. And we wonder why we're getting a failure rate that we have. This has to change dramatically.
Yeah.
And hopefully it will.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Okay. Now this shows you here the importance of the knowledge base. I took a very well-known text. You'll see it in the next slide. And I just changed 10% of the words. I think it's about 10%. So Smith had made a promise, but could terrible land keep it? In 1961, some Jabbits had reached a few hundred kilometers up into the surrounding belt, but the Glurf was almost 250,000 kilometers away. A trip to the Glurk and back would take 8 years. By 1961, only one turbulent had even been up in a Jabbit, and for only 15 stashes. Now, 10% of the words are not, you don't know them. You cannot understand the text. So let's see what the next slide and see what the text really said. This was a text about the man's trip to the moon. Kennedy had made a promise, but could America keep it? By 1961, some rockets had reached a few hundred miles into the surrounding belt, but the moon was almost 250,000 miles away. I don't have to go on. If you are at all, have a reasonable vocabulary and a reasonable knowledge base, no problem. But when 10% of a text is unknown, the text becomes meaningless. And we don't govern at all the complexity of the text. Well, I should say, we don't govern in a meaningful way the complexity of the text that we give kids. We're drowning them, huge numbers of them, in total nonsense as far as they're concerned. And it causes frustration, it causes anger, it causes a feeling of hopelessness. It's about the worst we could do. This has to be changed. It's not hard to change, but there's nobody offering a simple system that says, well, this text is okay because, this text is not okay because, and so on. And the text that we're given are given by a few firms in Texas because they got the stuff under George Bush years ago, and they just produce it. And they have no idea what they're producing.
It's interesting because something as an educator, a parent, what we're always trying to do is, or what we all should be trying to do is get to know your child's appropriate reading level and select texts that are appropriate reading levels for your child. But it looks like even with that, if 10% is unknown, the child will be lost even on a text that's made for, like, that's their level.
I have a totally, it is impossible to follow that plan, which sounds very good because it's individualized education. Instead, we have to create very different texts, which all children or the vast majority of children can understand. My model is not the way current texts are designed. My model is the way good Hollywood films are designed. When a Hollywood film is designed, they don't say, well, I'll change it for Joe Smith in first row, but I won't change it for Mary Clark. She'll go with, no, they know how to make a movie that holds the audience's attention. Not every detail, but they know how to present the information with enough visual support, with enough verbal support that the average human being can follow it. That's what we need in schools. We cannot, it's impossible to expect teachers to be the diagnosticians with 35 children and adapt their text to 35 different children. It's ludicrous to even make that claim. But we can design a text that will reach 90% of the kids, that they will find interesting, but they will be totally different from the text they're currently being offered.
A teacher sent a question, or not a teacher, I'm sorry, an attendee sent a question. Yes. You mentioned that your text is designed differently. Someone wants to know, and I know the answer, but I'll let you say it. Where can they find your kind of text for students?
Well, they can find it, first of all, on Comprendi right now. And they're welcome to have a free period. A free trial, thanks. I didn't have the word. I also, on Comprendi, you'll see many of the resources are free. You'll see articles I've written. You'll see books I've written. And it's all explained there. And hopefully we'll have some additional podcasts or webinars on this topic. It's extremely important. And it's the good answer. I mean, the good thing is we have the knowledge we need to do it well. We don't have any history of doing it well. And people don't want to change. People find systems don't want to change. I would make a curriculum based on clips of movies that would do amazing things to establish a knowledge base in a way children find fascinating. We have a huge number of very good movies in the past. They don't make these movies today for the most part. We have a huge corpus of movies that would, for example, if you want to discuss slavery, there are 5 or 6 great movies which you could give 3 or 4 minutes to a class. You've got the knowledge base built in, and then you can start proceeding from that point. I think I may have mentioned this in a previous webinar. It's just, it was something that was done by a teacher in Harlem that I was observing. Harlem is known as it's changing, as a place where there was a huge poverty population of Blacks. And his job as part of the New York City school system was to teach Shakespeare. I don't personally think everyone in the world has to know Shakespeare, but anyway, he had to teach Shakespeare. This is how he taught Hamlet. He said to adolescent boys, he said, imagine you're about 20, 25 years of age, and you were on a long journey and have just returned home. And you get back and you find out that while you've been gone, your father has died. And then you find out that he may not have actually just died. He may have been murdered by his brother, who then proceeded to marry your mother. And these kids are enraged. They're ready to kill. And he says, okay, let's see what Hamlet did about that situation. So in a 10-minute introduction, he got his entire class totally on board. Because human motive, that's why novels are so powerful if you use them well. The novel reaches deep universal emotions. If you capture those and then proceed to go into the harder type of concepts, you're going to have a much easier time because you've got kids totally on board with you. And it's hard to get all these ideas thrown at you in 1 hour session, but I'm trying to outline, like, there's a new world out there and we can do it well. We can do it in exciting ways. The greatest compliments I've gotten, I've heard it so many times. People have met me and said, I heard you lecture 25 years ago in London, and I remember everything you said. Well, I'm sure they don't remember everything I've said, but if you teach well, the stuff is there. You don't get the summer loss. We've done that with materials I've done with kids. My message today is, we have the potential for all the answers we need. And these are some of the concepts that we need to get there. In 1 hour, you're not going to get there.
Right.
It's seeing the language world in a totally different way.
Exactly. Before we move on from this slide, we did get another question that I wanted to ask.
Sure.
It says, if you come across text where more than 10% is unknown, but contains essential learning for the student, how do you recommend teaching this challenging text to that student?
By it will require some writing skills, but you will take a single paragraph and make it into 8 paragraphs. You will be redundant, repetitive. You will use simplifying concepts so that you will not race through the material. You will very carefully reconstruct the material. Now, I don't think teachers should have the job of reconstructing, but since the question was asked, somebody has to reconstruct the material. And if you reconstruct the material well, you'll get everybody on board. Years ago, they did a marvelous study. They found that with learning disabled children, if you lengthen the text by making it repetitive and redundant in interesting ways, you eliminated the difference between learning disabled and neurotypical kids. That more language helped. But of course, more language that's bad is not going to help. More language that is good is going to help. It's first of all, the pace of classroom dialogue is much too fast because the teacher also is under the constraint of keeping this group going, because if she feels that if she loses them, it's going to be chaos. So the pace is bump, 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 bump. That has to be changed. There's no way to teach. It was very interesting when I was consulting on Sesame Street. I said, you're going too fast for the kids to comprehend. That was way back. And they said, we know it, but we are only going to get funding if we have eyes on the screen. And the eyes on the screen we get by rapidly changing everything. So they, and Sesame Street as a cognitive remediation has failed. Kids liked watching it. They loved, Elmo and all those characters, but they started at the beginning with an impossible system, rapid learning of changing concepts. And all right, the kids who knew them, and the kids who didn't know them still didn't know them.
Right.
As I said, we have the knowledge base we need. We are simply not using it for a host of reasons. In the case of Sesame Street, it was they would lose all their funding if they didn't have so supposedly, this is really interesting. Supposedly they were free of the constraints of advertising, but they weren't, because they'd have lost all their funding if the children's eyes on the screen weren't as good as with advertising. So basically they had to become a mimic of advertising. We have got to be willing to change our thinking. Hopefully we will be.
Hopefully.
We have the answers, we're not using them.
Okay, thank you for your question. We have about 9 minutes, so I'm gonna go ahead and go through these slides. Okay.
Okay, this is another dimension that's very, very important. It's a very simple thing in communication. You have initiator and you have responder. In other words, if you're going to a doctor, he's basically the initiator. He's saying, what are your symptoms? What are you doing? Da, 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 da. And you're the responder. And in different situations, these change. They're role dependent. If you're with a superior and you're the subordinate, you'll act differently than if you're with a friend. They're age dependent because they get more complex with age. The neurotypical child flexibly handles all types of communication, where he's the initiator, where he's the responder, and so on. By the way, I want to just mention something, maybe it'll complicate things, but no one speaks about the fact that reading is a communication situation where the child is the responder. The child as a reader is only a responder. Where's the initiator? The initiator is the author who isn't there. So it is a much harder communication situation because the initiator is not there. So if you have any questions, you have no way to turn to that initiator. He's not there to answer it. So a good writer has a much harder task than a good speaker, because a good writer has to anticipate all the difficulties that his potential audience will have and overcome them. So, but reading is a communication situation. It is not just a skill in the child. Now, modern high-tech life this is a very huge problem. We're not going to even get into it today. But the child thinks he's totally in the initiating role when he's got a device. Why? Because he's pressing all the buttons. There's no one else around. So who else is there? He's in control. But it's really the program's in control. That child can't put in anything. He has to take the program that's given to him. But he thinks he's the initiator. And as a result, in school, when he has to be the responder, he's unable to do so because he says, I don't do that kind of thing. I push the buttons that I want. Nobody makes me be the responder. And school is predicated on the child being almost solely in the responding role. We now have a vast number of children who do not understand they have to be in the responding role. The biggest group of them is the children with attention deficit disorders. They never see themselves as in the responding role.
I think you're gonna spend here. Perfect.
So these are the different kinds of disorders that affect the initiating responding role. Okay. And then, of course, in addition, you've got the interfering behaviors where the kids start acting out, where they're giving irrelevant responses and so on. This is very complicated, but basically, if we begin to at least think in terms of the initiator responder role, we'll be making major advances in understanding what's going on and what we can do about it.
Wonderful. It's a very good introduction to it.
Yeah. Now, the levels of language, I said that, and this is I've sort of covered it, so I won't go now, but the here and now of everyday life is very important. It's available to preschoolers and it continues throughout our life. It isn't something that, oh, well, I used to do that when I was 4 years old. I don't talk about the here and now anymore. No, of course, you talk about the here and now all the time. But then school is highly dependent on the language of the there and then, which is a knowledge-based language, and huge numbers in our population don't have it. Children from low socioeconomic status, children with learning disabilities, children with attention deficit disorders, this becomes extremely difficult for them. So right now, I'm just pointing out the difficulties. I'm trying to indicate some of the solutions and give you the message there are solutions and we can work on them. And we'll have additional podcasts on them. Next one.
Sorry, there you go.
Okay. Now, here's a dimension that is really, really important. Students have told me it's made a huge difference in their life. Conversation, if it's intelligent conversation with people who are functioning fairly well, it is not question and answer. It is comment, comment, comment with a few questions in between. In other words, it is an interesting, attention-getting kind of exchange. It is unattainable for most children with language and communication problems. If you want to see it, take a child you're having difficulty with in a classroom and just talk to them in statement form, not questions. You know, Joey, we had plans to start the garden, but the weather's been terrible. And that's what you're going to get from Joey. Joey is going to look at you like you're a madman. A vast percentage of children who have any type of academic difficulty have no idea how to handle statements. It is not hard to train them. You could train or teach most children that skill within 2 to 3 months and give them enormously powerful skills, but no one's doing it. But it is if any teacher wants to try it, just make up a series of very coherent, reasonable statements, take some of the kids that you're really having trouble with and just comment to them. And what you're going to get is silence or irrelevant responses. So the issue of questions versus comments is extremely important. And basically, when individuals are verbally limited, the partner asks many questions. By the way, did you ever watch people with their dogs? Why are people saying to their dogs, Elmo, would you like to go out now? Well, Elmo was wagging his tail. He's got an idea. But Elmo never has answered that person. Why is this person continuing to question? Why do people question non-speaking individuals? I have no idea. You could, this is a great exercise. If a teacher has a dog, start speaking to them in comment form, just so you'll be able to speak in comment form to children who have verbal difficulties. If you can speak in comment form to children with verbal difficulties, you're well ahead of the game and well on your way to helping the children.
Great.
It's a fascinating, simple idea. It's
right
discussed.
Okay, I think perfect. We have time for our last slide.
Last slide. Okay.
Yes.
So basically, communication is a blending of two worlds. There's the social world, where I said we talk about initiator and responder. We have the different participants, the roles, superior, subordinate, and it should be different. Superior and subordinate should not be speaking like peers. It's wrong, but peers should be speaking like peers. Then you have intimate, distant. So if somebody knows you well, you can be very open and so, but if someone doesn't know you at all, you've got to be very cautious. So these are the social parameters that are important in communication. In terms of non-social, I've said this is sort of pulling everything together, hopefully. We're talking about comments and questions, a vital, simple distinction that is not considered nearly as sufficiently as it should. The topics are it can be behavioral routine. I mean, I'm sure they can go from simple to complex. It can be simple behavioral routines, everyday life experiences. And then as you go further into the curriculum, you get the information-based subjects, science, social studies, health, and so on. And the key is the rules of connected utterances. And there is almost nothing available to teachers on this. I do have one chapter that is going to be available on our website about classroom dialogue. And if you want to get into the realm of connected utterances, you can just access that article. We'll be putting it on fairly soon. I think I gave it to you already, but if not, it should be on in a few days.
Should be on there very soon. And if you don't see it or you can't find us, feel free to email us or contact us to the webpage and we will guide you and help you find it. All right. Well, Dr. Blank, thank you so much. That was a lot of good information, especially to fit in 1 hour. It was
I hope. Well, one of the things I'd like to suggest is if people take any particular aspect of these different topics and meet with colleagues and start a discussion group, it would be really very helpful. And if they want to communicate with us and ask us questions about it, they're most welcome to do that. So you've got, these are not any of the, none of the concepts that I raised are really unusual. It's just that they've never been put together in this way. We've not had the thinking and the clarity that we need, and that's what I was trying to give.
Yes, and I think you did. So I would like to say with that, we have run out of time. So if you have any additional questions, and as Dr. Blank said, if you want to try something and you want to follow up with us, or even if you have a topic you'd like to see us cover in a future webinar, we would love to hear from you from all of these things. You can contact us at our website, dmlearninglab.com. That is also where you can find the program Dr. Marion was referring to earlier and the chapter we will be uploading very soon. You will see a contact us option there, and we will be very happy to hear from you. To our wonderful attendees, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found this very valuable, and I hope to see you at our next webinar. And to Dr. Blank, thank you for another wonderful session that will really help so many educators, students, parents, and I can't wait for your next one.
It'll be fun. And also if people have questions, they should really feel free to ask.
Please do. We really do. You'll find that we love to talk and communicate with you all. So feel free. Don't feel shy about it. We'll be happy to hear from you.
I'm going to close with one. If you have these skills, you are so empowered. I've been in a number of foreign countries where people have said to me, come on, demonstrate. Well, I don't speak Dutch and I don't speak, I once spoke French, but I don't. And I will just tell a teacher what to do and it works perfectly. So we have such, just like computers work so beautifully, we can have language and dialogue and communication work just as beautifully and empower teachers. So it's a great field. Just it's very complicated. Well, it's very misused, and we have to correct that use.
Yes, you're right. Okay, everyone, that is our time. So please feel free, like we said, to contact us, and we hope to see you at our next session. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye.